Imagine you're sailing in the freezing ocean off the coast of Antarctica, and your ship sinks. In the year 1914, no radio, no radar, no GPS, no rescue. You would almost certainly die. For most people, this is a nightmare. But for one man, this nightmare was real and, strangely, he didn't seem afraid. This man was Ernest Shackleton, an explorer, an adventurer, and a leader from a different era who believed that human endurance had no limits. And his next mission was about to test that belief in a way no one could have ever imagined. Shackleton's goal was simple and completely insane: to be the first person to walk across the entire Antarctic continent. Why? For fame, for glory, and for the sheer desire to do what no human had done before. To find the right men for this impossible journey, Shackleton placed an infamous advertisement in a London newspaper. It read, "Men wanted for hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, safe return doubtful." You'd think no one would answer such an ad, but thousands of men applied. This was a different time, and these were different men, hungry for an adventure that would define their lives. The ship chosen for this monumental expedition was named Endurancer, word that would soon come to define the entire journey. Built in Norway by master shipbuilders, it was one of the strongest wooden ships ever constructed. Every single beam was designed to withstand the crushing pressure of polar ice. The Endurance was beautiful, powerful, and tough. Or so they thought. After 4 long years of planning, the Endurance finally set sail from England. But as it did, the world itself was falling apart. World War I had just begun. The British government, recognizing the importance of the mission, gave Shackleton a one-word telegram: proceed. And so, he sailed south, straight into history. The voyage began with a strange and unexpected twist. Partway through the journey, a young man was discovered hiding on deck. Shackleton was furious. The man, Perce Blackbro, had stowed away with a friend. It was too late to turn back now. This small act of leadership, this moment of grace, would later matter more than anyone could possibly imagine. On January 18, 1915, after months at sea, the Endurance was just one single day's sail away from the Antarctic continent. They were so close, and then disaster struck. Massive sheets of floating pack ice began to close in around the ship. It slowed them down, and then stopped them completely. The ice wasn't thick enough to walk on, but it was too dense to sail through. They were trapped. For years of planning, a lifetime of ambition, frozen in place, just miles from their destination. The crew tried everything to free the ship. They used ice chisels, axes, and saws, working for days in the brutal cold. But it was no use. The ice held them fast. And worse, much worse, the Antarctic winter was coming. In Antarctica, winter means months without sunlight. No sunrise, no sunset. Just a long, crushing darkness and temperatures that could freeze a man solid in minutes. The ship became completely frozen into the ice. And as the massive ice floe drifted, it carried the Endurance with it. They were moving, but in the wrong direction away from land, deeper into the frozen wasteland of the Weddell Sea. It was their way of staying sane, a small act of defiance against the overwhelming power of nature. But nature was not finished with them. When spring finally arrived, hope returned. The sun reappeared, and the ice began to shift and crack. The crew thought this was their moment of freedom. But instead of releasing the Endurance, the immense pressure of the moving ice began to crush it from all sides. The sounds were terrifying. Great wooden beams, thicker than a man's body, began to groan, splinter, and snap like matchsticks. Even this legendary ship, one of the strongest ever built, could not fight the power of the ice forever. The hull cracked open. Icy seawater poured in. Shackleton gathered his men on the buckling deck. He looked at them, and then at his dying ship, and said simply, "She's going, boys." The Endurance, their home, their castle, their only link to the outside world, was doomed. The crew salvaged what they could: food, lifeboats, and essential supplies. They watched as the ship they loved was slowly, violently swallowed by the ice. Then, with a final shudder, the Endurance slipped beneath the surface and disappeared forever. Now, 28 men stood alone on a floating sheet of ice in the middle of the most hostile sea on Earth. No ship, no land in sight, no hope of rescue. Their new plan was an act of pure desperation. They would try to walk across the unstable, shifting sea ice, dragging their heavy lifeboats and supplies with them to reach land. It was 346 miles away. When we last left the crew of the Endurance, they were standing on a floating sheet of ice in the middle of the Antarctic Sea. Their ship was gone. Winter was returning, and the ice beneath their feet was breaking apart. For most people, this would have been the end. For Ernest Shackleton, it was only the beginning. Shackleton ordered the men to make a new camp directly on the ice floe. They called it Ocean Camp. Tents were pitched, supplies were meticulously rationed, and the dogs were fed at least, until the food began to run out. The ice was their world, a slow, drifting raft carrying them farther and farther from safety. Yet somehow, against all odds, the men stayed calm. They became hunters, taking seals and penguins for food. They passed the endless, frozen days playing cards, reading books, and telling stories. Shackleton was a master of psychology. He carefully paired men in tents, making sure an optimist was always there to balance a realist. He understood that morale was just as vital as food. But their world was literally dissolving. The ice was thinning. Cracks began to snake across the floe, splitting the very ground beneath their feet. By April 1916, the situation was critical. The ice floe was breaking apart violently. Massive cracks would open up without warning, sometimes just a few feet from where the men slept. Shackleton made the call: launch the boats. The crew piled into 3 small lifeboats and pushed off into the Bransfield Strait, one of the most dangerous stretches of water on Earth. For days, they battled freezing waves, sheer exhaustion, and gnawing hunger. Men fell into the icy ocean and were dragged back out, their clothes freezing solid on their bodies. Every muscle ached with a deep, relentless cold. Finally, after nearly 5 days at sea, they spotted land. They landed on a place called Elephant Island. It was the first solid ground they had touched in 497 days. They had survived, but they were not saved. Elephant Island was a desolate, unforgiving rock. No ships ever passed this way. No one would stumble upon them by chance. A rescue mission was impossible because no one in the world even knew where they were. Shackleton knew this, and so he made the hardest decision of his life. He would leave most of his men behind, taking the strongest of the 3 boats. A 22-foot lifeboat named the James Caird Shackleton chose 5 of his best men. their goal was almost suicidal: to sail 800 miles across the Southern Ocean to a whaling station on the island of South Georgia. One mistake, one navigational error, one capsized wave would mean certain death for them, and a slow, agonizing end for the men they left behind. As the small boat disappeared over the horizon, the men on Elephant Island could only do one thing: wait and hope. Back on the island, the remaining 22 crew members turned their 2 overturned boats into a makeshift shelter. They hunted seals and penguins, their only source of food. They melted ice for drinking water, and then winter returned in its full, terrifying fury. The wind screamed through their shelter. Frostbite began to claim fingers and toes. Sickness spread. One man's foot became so badly infected that it had to be amputated, right there inside the freezing, dark hut, with only the most basic of tools. Still, no one gave up. They clung to a single, powerful belief: Shackleton would return. He had to. Meanwhile, the James Caird was in a desperate fight for its life. The Southern Ocean threw everything it had at them. Towering waves, like liquid mountains, threatened to flip the tiny boat. Ice formed constantly on the deck and rigging, and it had to be chipped away by hand, a task that left them soaked and frozen. Navigation was a nightmare. They depended on rare, fleeting glimpses of the sun through breaks in the clouds to take a reading. A single error would send them into the vast, empty expanse of the open ocean, lost forever. They saw it land. They had reached South Georgia, but their incredible journey wasn't over. They had landed on the wrong side of the island. The whaling stations were on the other side, across a range of uncharted, unconquered mountains and glaciers. To reach help, Shackleton and 2 of his men had to make a final, desperate push. They had no map, no tents, and no sleeping bags. They had only 3 days' worth of food and a length of rope. They walked day and night, carving steps into the ice, climbing ridges that no human had ever crossed. If they stopped to rest, they would freeze to death. After 36 exhausting non-stop hours, 3 bearded, tattered, and broken men staggered into the Stromness whaling station. The hardened Norwegian whalers stopped and stared in disbelief. They looked like ghosts. It was Shackleton, but he wasn't home yet. His first words were not of his own survival, but of his men. The rescue was on. It took 4 separate attempts over 3 long months to break through the impenetrable Antarctic sea ice. But finally, on August 30th, 1916, a ship reached Elephant Island. Shackleton stood on the deck, anxiously counting the figures on the shore. 1, 2, 3, all the way to 22. Every single man was alive. After nearly 2 years stranded in the harshest environment on Earth, not a single life had been lost. In 2022, the wreck of the Endurance was finally found at the bottom of the Weddell Sea. Over 10,000 feet down, it was perfectly preserved in the cold, dark water, a silent monument to the greatest survival story ever told. Shackleton may have failed his original mission to cross Antarctica, but in the end, he succeeded at something far, far greater. He brought every man home. If you enjoyed this story, I hope you'll remember what it truly teaches us. True survival isn't just about physical strength. It's about leadership. It's about hope. And it's about the power of human endurance. Thanks for watching.